Hello and welcome to Policy Watch. Rajesh Mahapatra returns to Policy Watch after a while and we'll discuss the second wave of economic reform that seems to be coming. But before Rajesh and I can get down to it, here are the headlines. The government in overdrive, long pending plans queued up for approval. Chidambaram takes control, pension, insurance reforms, infra fund on the annual. The Kelkar panel submits its report, wants the service tax rate to be 8% from the current 12%, also stresses on GST implementation. The insurance sector gets a boost. Regulatory restrictions imposed 2 years ago might be eased. And FM meets industry, gets wish list, sends India Inc. back positive. Our first story this week, the Vijay Kelkar Committee on Fiscal Consolidation has fixed the spotlight firmly back on the long-awaited and much-delayed goods and services tax, among other several important recommendations. A lack of consensus between states, especially those ruled by the opposition, has prevented the introduction and passage of the landmark tax reform, which seeks to impose a uniform rate across a range of goods and services throughout the country. The Kelkar panel report has emphasized the need for GST to be introduced and passed in the winter session of Parliament. Here's a report. Take a look. This man was put in charge of coming up with a blueprint towards fiscal consolidation after P. Chidambaram took over as finance minister. Former Finance Secretary Vijay Kelkar's report was released, and apart from the various prescriptions for fiscal consolidation, the panel has also highlighted the need to introduce the long-pending goods and services tax in the upcoming winter session of Parliament. The goods and services tax, a path-breaking tax reform initially mooted by Chidambaram in his previous innings as finance minister, has been stuck in limbo despite concerted efforts by his predecessor Pranab Mukherjee to reach a consensus with the states regarding the same.
Well, I think the main contention seems to be on the overall rate structure, which the import committee on GST recommending and what the state governments are really planning for. And the other important contention is the compensation that the state governments are expected to get. Although the 13th Finance Commission has recommended some compensation, it looks like there seems to be some kind of disagreement on a particular number, both on the compensation as well as on the rates.
The GST seeks to streamline the tax structure and, if implemented, will do away with several indirect taxes levied on goods and services by the central and state governments in India. While Kelkar himself has admitted that April 2013 deadline for the GST rollout looks unlikely, the report has recommended that the government should further prune the list of service tax exempted businesses like non-profit organizations, and that the rate should be reduced from the current 12% to 8% so as to align them with the GST rate and facilitate the introduction of the GST bill.
I'm sure that this will actually give some kind of a boost for the finance ministry to take more difficult actions. We have already seen the finance ministry has already taken measures to reduce the oil subsidy. By the way, the Kelkar report actually suggests for 4 rupees hike in the diesel prices, but the finance ministry has gone ahead and said it's increasing by 5 rupees.
Taking a cue from the finance minister's statement last week, the Kelkar committee has also suggested that on the direct taxes side, a further tweaking of the direct taxes code is needed if the government wants to avoid considerable unacceptable losses on a continued basis. Among other recommendations by the panel, a few stand out on the direct and indirect taxes side. These include a tighter scrutiny of each and every taxpayer to avoid and curb evasions, identify all cases where self-assessment tax has been paid or payable, and take steps to prevent deferment of advance tax. The panel has also recommended that the government make either a PAN card or the UID card compulsory for even minor financial transactions. The report also says that fiscal consolidation can only be sustainable when the tax to GDP ratio is raised to 07-08 levels of 11% and above. The rate of interest charged to defaulting companies, according to the panel, should be high and reflecting market rates, and the setting up of a directorate to make tax administration more efficient has also been mooted. Athar for RSTV. Now, Rajesh, we of course stressed a lot on the GST in that report. But what, according to you, struck you most about the Kelkar panel report?
Well, what has been hogging the headlines is the subsidy, recommendations regarding subsidy. And subsidy is is a catchword. Is sometimes it's for some, everybody loves to talk about subsidy, and sometimes you get the impression that all ills afflicting this economy have got to do with subsidy. Now there are different ways of looking at Kelkar Committee report. You could look at it as a report that sort of is talking about recommending measures to streamline government finances. Is a kind of a recipe to get certain accounting discipline. That's one way of looking at it, and that would be a very narrow way of looking at it. There's a larger context to what the report is talking about and what its implications could be. Now, of course, you spoke about GST, goods and services tax. You spoke about the report talks about bringing about other reforms in the taxation segment.
A fresh look at DTC also.
It is talking about a deferral and a comprehensive review of the direct tax code. And ironically, Dr. Kelkar was one of the guys who had actually pushed for a direct tax code. At least, I mean, the key principles that are there in the direct tax code. To me, the takeaway from these reports are, okay, let me go back and sort of take you back to what various newspapers have spoken about, what is the popular public perception about this report is, and how this has been taken in terms of the subsidy burden of the government, and that has to be rationalized. If you actually look back, if you go back in history, if you go back to 1995, 96, when this whole issue of subsidy came into spotlight, and that was the first time the government actually set up a panel to study and estimate how much of subsidy
the government actually gives out.
And that included hidden and unhidden subsidies. In those days, you didn't have fuel subsidy going out of government budget. So primarily the two subsidies we talked about at that point in time was food subsidy and fertilizer subsidy. Now, if you add up those two subsidies, about 17 years ago, they used to add up to about 45,000 crore. Today, your subsidy burden, including fuel subsidy, is about 1,70,000 crore. But if you take fuel subsidy out, it would be somewhere around 1,40,000 crore.
Still double.
It's a threefold increase. But your GDP has increased more than fourfold. We were a $500 billion economy 17 years ago. Today, we are closing in on
So it's a very skewed ratio then, isn't it?
No, so which means the subsidy as a ratio of GDP hasn't actually gone down. So to say that subsidy is the culprit in pushing your fiscal deficit up would be somewhat misleading, if not entirely.
So are you saying that the Kelkar panel report got it slightly wrong in saying that subsidy is
No, what I'm trying to say is that, you see, look, subsidy were a concern at that point in time. Fiscal deficit was a concern at that point in time. That concern hasn't got heightened from a subsidy point of view. That's what I'm trying to argue. If you're trying to say that your fiscal worries today have been precipitated by a high subsidy bill, that would be, in my view, would be somewhat misleading. What has happened, and where the government seems to have had little control, we are not looking at the way the government's non-planned spending, especially the impact of the 6th Pay Commission, the 5th Pay Commission way back in the late 90s, have sort of contributed to increasing the wage bill of the government. And the government hasn't done anything to sort of downsize itself.
Rajesh, we have a lot to talk about. We don't have that much time. I want to talk about another point that the Kelkar report actually mentioned, cutting the service tax rate to 8%. This is what he has recommended. I've been speaking to economists right throughout the week after the Kelkar panel report came out, and some of them have also submitted their drafts to the finance ministry as well. And they've told me that in their draft, they've recommended a revenue neutral rate, if GST is to be taken, around 12%.
12 to 14%.
12 to 14%. Is Mr. Kelkar aiming for something that is not feasible by saying service tax rate should be aligned with GST rate and should come down to 8%?
No, I think what we're talking about, if you actually aim for a service tax rate of 8%, if you bring down all of these, not just service tax rates, or the substantive part of the indirect taxation rates, to 8%, you would actually get a revenue neutral rate of about 12 to 14%. And that's the direction in which we should move. I think, see, taxation does two things. One, it raises money for the government. Two, tax is a tool in the hands of the government to redistribute money across different income classes. So, a progressive taxation system means you should have less reliance on indirect taxes, because when the Aam Aadmi goes and buys his detergent, food, he pays an indirect tax on everything by way of excise duty. When he consumes power, he pays a service tax. So that burden should come down. And the direct tax burden direct taxes should account for a larger share of your tax equity. That's what has happened in our case. And that's a good thing. But it hasn't happened the way it should have happened, the pace at which it should have increased.
Rajesh, 40 seconds or less. This is the last question on the Kelkar committee. What are the hits of the Kelkar panel report? What do you think, according to you, are the misses?
I won't see it in terms of hits and misses. I would see in terms of what are the feasible things and what are.
So what are those things?
I think Dr. Kelkar has himself said that it's not a T20 match. It's a test match. It will take longer time. But quickly moving, I think the government has moved on the fuel subsidy front. And I think there is certain merit in terms of curtailing diesel subsidy, in terms of curtailing LPG subsidy. There may be, I may have differences in the way LPG subsidy is being sought to be cut. There could have been better ways by protecting the poor households who really depend on it. But I think that's a move in the right direction. I think his recommendation, his suggestion that the direct tax code has to be deferred, I think is a sensible suggestion, because we are not in a position today to afford, because our tax GDP ratio is coming down.
And also, he says the draft is not ready yet. It's not enough. The DTC draft, as it stands currently.
Well, I mean, I haven't looked at those aspects, but the main takeaway is that today, given the fact that our tax GDP ratio has declined, tax GDP ratio has to go up to 14%. That must be our medium-term objective. And I think in that respect, deferring direct tax code, it makes a sensible suggestion. Right. Expediting work on GST makes a very sensible suggestion, and that's in the realms of feasibility. You know, we have 2014 elections, so it would be a little difficult to get all the states around the point. But I think the government should not let go of the momentum. It should keep working on it, and we will surely miss the deadline. I don't think anything is going to happen in 12-13, but clearly 13-14, if it comes through, it will be a welcome change.
On that note, we'll take a break. We'll have a lot more to talk about with Rajesh Mahapatra in just a while. Welcome back. We are still talking to Rajesh Mahapatra, of course, Deputy Editor of the Hindustan Times. Our second story this week now. The Finance Minister is going into overdrive with yet another round of reforms on the anvil. This time, it's the struggling sector that has been in the grip of a semi-crisis after tighter norms were imposed 2 years ago, the insurance sector. The recommendations, if notified, are expected to generate higher sales for life insurance companies and also include a 15-day clearance deadline for simple products, while all other products will be cleared in a 30-day window. So we'll talk about the insurance sector, but let's talk about the second wave of reform that everyone's talking about. First, it was insurance. These norms, if notified, will help the insurance sector, like our story said. Buzz is that pension PFRDA bill is going to come into Parliament in the winter session. He's going to Mr. Chidambaram is going to clear PFRDA as well. Buzz is that he might give the manufacturing industry a package as well. Mr. Chidambaram in overdrive. He's doing exactly what he's supposed to do right now. That's why he's there.
Yeah, I think some of these measures were overdue for a fairly long time. Because when you speak about second wave of reforms, what should ideally top that agenda has got to do with institutional reforms, regulatory reforms.
And insurance tops the sector, obviously, the economy.
Well, I mean, each of them is important, and I think there are some. So the good thing is that a lot of the action is happening now. The government seems to be trying to do things My only fear is whether it has come too late, and sometimes one wonders why couldn't they do some of these things? Because, for instance, if you talk about insurance, we're not talking about the FDI limit, but the other stuff that has been cleared now. This could have been done before.
And these are regulatory changes. They could
Yes,
have done it very easily.
regulatory changes, and they could have been done before. There is also talk of bringing all regulators under one umbrella body.
Super regulator, as we call
Super regulator. I don't know how it would work, but at least to the extent that there is some focus in terms of bringing synergy among various regulators, because sometimes you find some of them are at cross purposes with each other. And that
Everyone
doesn't-
remembers the SEBI IRDA war.
that doesn't work. That doesn't work. And I think that is something which, as a modern economy, you need. A modern economy needs very strong regulatory framework. I think there is a positive movement in that direction, and that's a welcome development. We'll have to wait and see how they play out, how successful they become, and how soon they start kicking in. The other thing which one has some reason of hope or optimism with which one can look forward to, and that's what one is expecting the cabinet to do now when it takes up the 12th plan, 5-year plan draft. There's a proposal to set up a national investment board.
Absolutely.
One doesn't know how it is going to work, but what one has heard about, what one has read about, you do need something like that to sort of give a lifeline, restore a lifeline into your infrastructure sector, which is really in a bad shape.
And this was mooted very recently by Mr. Chidambaram, then seconded by Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia on our channel as well. And it's expected that it will come in any time in November now. You think that one final layer which no one can supersede, if that decides, if the NIB decides that this project has to be cleared, nobody can overturn it, you think that'll speed up processes, you'll speed up infra projects as well?
Yeah, most of these things get stuck because of lack of political backing. And I think what they're trying to get around with a body like this, a super empowered body, is actually get that adequate amount of political backing, political supervision and political push to go ahead with key projects. And they're talking about large projects of national interest.
Absolutely. Right? Last question on insurance. Are these measures going to help? They're obviously going to help the insurance sector. But do you think that just sticking to life insurance right now, not general insurance, perhaps that could have been done in one go?
I'm not an insurance expert. There must be some rationale. But I think, when we talk about some of the liberalization in insurance sector, we have to also see how much of financial sector deepening that has happened in India, where you need to also look at the interest of your own domestic players. You don't want to be, you'd like to have the best practices come in by way of foreign players,
but also
you would also like to create, and I think, by calibrating the opening up of the insurance sector, we have been able to create certain very sound, large domestic players in the sector, private players, which would have been unthinkable 2 decades ago.
Right.
I think that has paid off, and I don't see any reason, if something has paid off, something has worked well for you, why you should dispense with it, or why would you rush with something that you are not sure of.
So it's a fairly calibrated approach, like the rationale being given by the ministry as well. On that note, Rajesh, we'll take another break. We'll get our third story after the break. Don't go anywhere. Lots more to come on Policy Watch this week. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Policy Watch now. Industry captains met Finance Minister P. Chidambaram on Wednesday and discussed the macroeconomic situation and growth, among other things. Representatives of 3 chambers, FICCI, ASSOCHAM and CII, interacted with the Finance Minister to find ways to further improve corporate confidence and boost economic growth. The meeting comes in the backdrop of the recent reform initiatives taken by the government, including FDI in multi-brand retail and allowing foreign airlines to invest up to 49% in domestic carriers. Policy Watch finds out what industry really wants.
I have with me Ms. Naina Kidwai, Senior Vice President FICCI. She was also present at the meeting which took place between Finance Minister and industry leaders. Welcome to Policy Watch, ma'am.
Thank you.
First thing first, did the finance minister give positive signals to continue on the reform agenda which the government has started?
He has left us in no doubt that continuing on the reform agenda is absolutely an imperative. In that, he recognizes, as we have in fact been asking for a long time from FICCI, that we bring the fiscal deficit under control. And the moves we have seen, they're still small steps, but bringing down the subsidy, for example, on fuel, diesel in particular, and we've seen those actions there, are very important. The signaling effect of this was so important, as you've seen, that the stock markets went up, we saw the rupee appreciate, and all of this is extremely critical for us as a country, because if we cannot bring our fiscal deficit under control, we have the danger of dropping from investment grade, and that will put the cost of borrowing for industry up by at least double. So we cannot afford to have a drop in the investment grade of the country.
Ma'am, also these reforms are facing a lot of opposition from few political establishments and political parties. Have you chalked out a plan to convince those political establishments?
You know, if you look at some of the big things that we would like to see happen, GST is an example. All estimates, and FICCI has put this out publicly, is that with bringing GST in, we expect a 1.7% increase in the GDP of India. Now, this can't be wrong for the country. If one big move can bring 1.7% GDP back to the country, why aren't we doing it?
Thank you so much, ma'am, for talking to Policy Watch. We heard the senior vice president of FICCI there, and she seems very positive after meeting the finance minister. And she said that the power sector and the infrastructure sector got special mention in that meeting. And that's all I have for now. Back to you in the studio.
That was Rahul Kapoor with that story. Now, our first story this week on Policy Watch. The Kelkar panel submitted its report last week. Gave a lot of recommendations. He wants the service tax rate to be 8% from the current 12%. We talked to Rajesh Mahapatra about it. He also wants a fresh look at DTC, which my guest agrees with. The GST implementation bit, obviously, everyone thinks that it is high time that the goods and services tax gets implemented and gets a similar rate across the country. On subsidies, however, my guest, of course, agrees, and a lot of people would agree with him, that the way that he wants to get rid of LPG subsidies, perhaps a lot of people have some problems with him. Nobody says that the Kelkar report panel is perfect, but it is definitely a good start. Our second story on our show this week was the insurance sector reforms that have gotten a boost by Mr. Chidambaram-led North Block right now. This also comes as part of the second wave of reforms that we might see. First, there were the big bang reforms. Now there are the second wave of reforms. Insurance sector, of course, will get a lot of help by easing those restrictions that they had put on them 2 years ago. Clearing simple products in 15 days and all other products in 30 days might just help generate better sales for that struggling sector. As far as the second wave of reform is concerned, PFRDA bill might just pass. Pension reforms have been stuck in limbo for a while. That also could bring some cheer to industry. That's all we have time for on Policy Watch this week. We must thank Rajesh Mahapatra for coming and joining us again on Policy Watch. Till next time when we get you another edition of Policy Watch, Athar Khan saying goodbye, good night, and thank you for watching.